Spiritual Direction from Dante, Avoiding the Inferno, a book by Father Paul Pearson of the Oratory. Canto 26. Topics: The Solitary Path, Special Gifts and Special Responsibilities, Gifted Failures, Gifts as God's Investments in Us, Demagogues and True Leaders. In the spiritual life, we often depend upon support and guidance from the church, friends and family, or from good books, or the intercession of the saints. In the end, however, no one can do it for us, just as someone might help us rehabilitate after surgery, but cannot exercise on our behalf. The spiritual life is something personal, something between us and God. But when we think of drawing closer to God, the natural response to His infinite greatness is to become more aware of our own limitations and frailty. Standing in God's presence is a humbling experience. It is easy to wonder why God would even be interested in drawing Himself to us. Psalms 8:4 says, "What is man that you are mindful of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him?" In line 15, after inveighing against the evils of Florence, Dante scrambles up the bridge to the next ditch. His climb is an image of the spiritual life. He shows, by his own example, that the only way forward in the spiritual life is through humility and divine assistance. Dante needs Virgil's assistance to pull him up, and even with that help, Dante needs to go down on all fours in order to manage to get to the top, saying, "We couldn't move the foot without the hand." Similarly, in our own lives, regardless of the assistance we receive along the way, we must choose in our own hearts to walk the path of the spiritual life. No one else can do it for us, though they can help. Perhaps that is what makes it a solitary way, regardless of the companionship of Virgil. Here, the way, the solitary way, is particularly treacherous. Perhaps this image is part of Dante's preparation for meeting the next group of sinners. We are entering into a pit in which people of great genius are being punished, not for having that genius, but for misusing it. The steepness of the way is an indication of how hard it can be to possess great gifts and talents, and yet to remain humble and dedicated to the spiritual life. The theme of humility continues here. Dante must restrain his poetic talent here, holding his genius under tighter rein. Perhaps that's the greatest mortification for him, lest it dash off without the guidance of virtue. This is yet another example of Dante front-loading the imagery. He's subtly preparing the reader for what is to come before he explicitly raises the subject. Dante is preparing the way by means of imagery for the hubris of the false counselors, who have used their genius at the service of vice. They are punished here for the abuse of the very power they share with Dante, a power he is now convinced must be placed under the guidance of virtue. And the gifts were that some should be apostles, and some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for their work of ministry. Ephesians 4:11 and 12. We believe that God has endowed some people with special intellectual and rhetorical gifts, gifts to teach, advise, guide, and lead. But what happens when the light entrusted to them is misused? Their personal charisma and talents lead others falsely, like the candle that attracts the moth, only to destroy it. They will be responsible not only for their own failings, but for those of the people who trustingly followed them. In 25, the imagery in this ditch is focused on light, with particular reference to the scriptural image of the lamp on a lampstand and the image of the city shining on a hill. The light, according to the scriptural metaphor, is to be placed on high for all to see. The purpose of the light, after all, is to illuminate. Here, however, the imagery is all inverted. The light is placed in the pit, down low, rather than on high, and only flickering like fireflies. This light does not do what it was intended to do, shed useful light. The light illuminates only itself, but nothing around it. Until this point in the narrative, the imagery seems quite peaceful, as Dante himself says, like a warm summer evening, until the reality of this light is revealed. The light itself is fraudulent. What it is in reality is not what it appears to be. These flickering lights are not fireflies. They are damned souls. The sinful soul is the wick at the center of the flame. Not one flickering light reveals the theft, for each one stows away the sinner's soul. This light of the flame is fraudulent also in its function, because rather than illuminating in any useful way, as flames normally do, here the light obscures their identities. The light itself, the symbol of their genius, has become their punishment, burning but not shedding helpful light. The reality that he observes is so strange that Dante still stares in wonder until he hears it from Virgil. He couldn't believe his own eyes, but Virgil gives him reassurance. In line 55, Ulysses and Diomedes are punished together because they sinned together. This is an important clue to the true sin of Ulysses. Not the sin he so eloquently recounts later in the Canto, but the sin he committed with Diomedes, namely the Trojan horse. It says in line 56 and 57, "As two they meet, God's vengeance, as they sinned and met his wrath." Ulysses' account of his apparently heroic journey is a classic case of misdirection. His speech hides the truth rather than reveals it. Diomedes' presence reminds us of the truth of Ulysses' sin, even if Ulysses himself won't confess it openly to Dante and Virgil. Hero worship has a long and very human history. It is part of our nature to look to others for inspiration in our own lives. And when we find someone who seems to embody our ideals and rise above normal human frailties, we hold them up as shining examples to be followed or imitated. As we expect them to live up to the picture we have formed of them by acting in an edifying and inspiring way. And how disappointing it can be when we discover that our hero has clay feet. Their faults, now that we see them, appear even more severe than those of normal people, since we expect so much more of them. They had so much more potential. As the old Latin saying goes, corruptio optimi pessima. The corruption of the best is the worst. The failures of the rich and famous are obvious targets of our judgment. How could people who have been given so much fall so far? But each one of us will be judged not only about whether we have sinned, but also about whether we have used our gifts profitably. Who can really say, I have done all that I could do with what I've been given? In line 65, Dante, as a poet, wants to meet Ulysses and says, "Teacher, I pray with all my heart and pray again up to 1,000 prayers." The Trojan War is, for Dante, part of the foundational myth of the Holy Roman Empire. Aeneas flees Troy precisely so that Rome can be founded. Just as Dante was drawn to Homer in the Circle of Limbo, so here he wants to converse with one of the characters from Homer's great works, Ulysses. But Virgil, although granting Dante's request, requires Dante to be silent. His language would offend Ulysses' Greek ears, yet another humiliation for a man who makes his living by his words. Virgil, whose epic, the Aeneid, continued the story begun by Homer, calls out to Diomedes and Ulysses almost as a suppliant. Throughout the journey with Dante, Virgil has commanded the damsels to speak, but here it is only humble beseeching that comes from his mouth. That is the proper tone for true genius. Speech seems to cause the flame to intensify. The act of communicating appears to add to the soul's sufferings. The flame moves with the words as though the flame itself were the tongue speaking. Dante is refining the imagery of that flame. Now it seems to be a tongue of fire, like that which descended on Pentecost, bringing with it the gifts of the Holy Spirit. These souls, the false counselors like Ulysses or Guido de Montefeltro, had great gifts of communicating, a sort of secular gift of tongues. These might have been natural gifts, but they are gifts nonetheless, and gifts which carried with them a responsibility. This ditch of hell is, in a real way, about the responsibility of genius. The recipient of such gifts is supposed to become the servant of the talents entrusted to him. Luke 12:48 says, "Everyone to whom much is given, of him will much be required." Gifts and talents bring with them responsibilities. God expects a return upon talents entrusted to us. These gifts were given to us by God. Although it is tempting to take credit for them ourselves or to use them for our own profit or glorification, they are not our exclusive property, but rather God's investment in us. The church reminds us of the source of our talents when we venerate the saints. And it says, "For you are praised in the company of your saints, and, crowning their merits, you crown your own gifts." It's a preface of the saints. In line 90, Ulysses' speech is one that must be greeted with great caution. We cannot take his words at face value because speech has been the tool of his trade and his instrument of sin. Are we to hear a truthful assessment of his failures, a sort of confession, or are we to be treated to a display of sinful technique? Listener, beware. As we listen to his explanation of the reason for his damnation, compare it to the facts. He sinned jointly with Diomedes. That is why he is here. But where is Diomedes in this account of his sea voyage? He seems to be using the classical device of misdirection, telling us a story that is compelling and entertaining, but does not really respond directly to our questions. Are his words anything more than a cover-up for the ignoble trickery of the Trojan horse? Perhaps Ulysses does not want to be remembered for something that might appear to be a cowardly tactic. It's not the legacy a hero wants to leave behind him. In line 91, the sorceress Circe couldn't make Ulysses lay aside the love he had for his son, his father, and his wife Penelope. He presents himself as a devoted family man struggling heroically against temptation. Nothing base could keep him away from his loved ones. He is leading the reader to the conclusion that something greater, something noble, would be the only thing that could turn him away. Ulysses describes his journey as a noble quest for full human experience. What some might consider irresponsible and even uncharitable towards his wife and family waiting for him at home, Ulysses casts as a noble enterprise. He intends to inspire his listeners by his words and example. Nothing should stand in the way of our quests. We need to be ready to sacrifice lesser things for those truly noble goals that define the dignity of our humanity. But is the desire to experience life to the fullest really the same as the noble desire for knowledge? Do we need experience of every vice in order to be wise? His words sound shockingly like those of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, leading Eve to experience good and evil firsthand, and so become like God. The original seducer was, after all, first an angel of light. Perhaps that helps explain why someone so far down in hell can come across as an appealing and sympathetic character. And perhaps the fact of his appeal tells us something more about us than it does about him, that we are still susceptible to that original call of pride, to know things and do things for ourselves, without God. In line 106, the Pillars of Hercules, also the Straits of Gibraltar, were the boundaries of the ancient world, and prudence would seem to demand that they stop there. Most moderns, however, would look on Ulysses' determination to continue as brave and heroic, a supremely human achievement, redefining our own limitations. Ulysses is moving beyond his own boundaries, to boldly go where no man has gone before. And don't we all want to cheer him on? Doesn't real progress require that bold men like him make these choices, risk even their lives, and discover new things? Perhaps his boat should be christened the HMS Pelagian, after the heretic who argued that we could work out our salvation through our own power and initiative. Ulysses is being bold if those boundaries and limitations are in fact false, and human capabilities can go beyond them. But are all boundaries false? Can we redefine ourselves ad infinitum? Our status as creatures, whether known through revelation or metaphysical analysis, tells us that we are, by our very nature, finite beings. And that is precisely what it means to be a creature. Does our dignity come from redefining ourselves however we please and as frequently as we please, or in discovering what God has created us to be? An existentialist would give a very different answer from that of a Christian. It is that existentialist inside all of us who cheers on Ulysses. But wasn't that same voice offering the apple to Eve, suggesting that she redefine herself as the Catechism describes without God, before God, and not in accordance with God? God both gives us our limitations and calls us to move beyond those obstacles that are placed in our path by sin or sociological influences. He comes to set us free. We seem to live in a world where a leader is considered great because he has the ability to stir up a crowd. But the ability to manipulate to action is not the same as leading. True leadership requires a clear sense of our ultimate goals and priorities, and a wisdom about how to achieve those goals. Merely inciting a crowd might require skill, but it is the art of the demagogue, not of the leader. History offers us many examples of this important distinction, but unfortunately, most examples are frequently of demagoguery rather than leadership. In line 119, notice that Ulysses calls on his comrades to be real men, and he says, "For you were never made to live like brutes, but to pursue the good in mind and deed." His words so inflame them that I hardly could have held them after that. His words have done their job. His speech is successful, if by that you mean that Ulysses has gotten his own way. His gifts have been used. He has won, and they will follow him. In justice, he must bear some responsibility for them because they are with him only because of his ability and his desire to convince them. But where is he leading them? What good are they pursuing? And what truth are they hoping to discover? Isn't it really just the thrill of adventure dressed up in the garments of a noble quest? In 133, it turns out that there is no new knowledge, no noble goal achieved. After 5 months of traveling, their only discovery is the sighting of a mountain that is tall beyond their wildest imagination. This mountain, in fact, Mount Purgatory, in the southern hemisphere, is a sign of the salvation that could have been theirs if they had been humble enough to submit themselves to God. Within sight of this symbol of God's ever-active mercy, of God's working to help them to overcome their self-imposed limitations, their boat sinks. There are boats that will make it to the shores of that mountain, but only those with God or his representative as the helmsman. God himself would have brought them to this very spot, to the shores of purgatory. We can't arrive there by our own devices, and no adventurer will ever discover it. As Dante has shown by example, it is only discovered on one's knees.